the way that we've approached scripture, I would say for the past few hundred years is something like, I'm a rational being, God has given me a reason, God has given me the capacity to understand. And so now I stand here and now I read scripture and I interpret scripture with different hermeneutical strategies. Whereas in this kind of symbolic way of thinking, what happens is that scripture actually becomes the lens through which you look at the world. And so the way to kind of understand that would be that the first chapters in Genesis are actually like a kind of pattern. They're a pattern which describes reality. And then all of scripture is an unfolding of that pattern. And it culminates, of course, into Christ, who kind of reveals the totality of this whole structure, and then points to the eschaton, which is, let's say, the final totality of all this whole pattern. And so you start with like a little example, like you start with a mountain. It's harder for people to remember that the Garden of Eden is a mountain because it doesn't say that in Genesis. It says it in Ezekiel, but that you have this mountain with a tree at the top, and you have these people, up there, and then they fall, they go down the mountain, and they end up in a world of hostility, of thorns, and then they have to wear garments of skin. They kind of cover themselves with different garments. Then they build cities. This whole process of accumulation of technology, of layers and layers and layers, put over this seed that's like, let's say, pure soul that has fallen and has started to become tainted. And then that ultimately leads to the flood. And now then everything breaks down and the water comes in and the whole world is kind of destroyed and has to start over. And the fall happens through pride, right? It happens through self-sufficiency. It's like you think you've got it all. You don't need anything above you. It's like, I've got this. I try to take that which is above me for myself. And so obviously in that case, it's to want to reach up to God. So once you realize that, let's say that's the pattern, this basic pattern of a story, then you start to look at the other stories and you see that it's the pattern of the Tower of Babel is the same story as the fall, right? Like you go up, you want to reach God, you want to take the name of God for yourself. And in doing that, what happens is fragmentation and tumbling and falling down. The tower falls and everybody gets spread out into the world and into confusion. You'll start looking at stories, you'll start to see that this type of story just repeats itself over and over. This pattern of a mountain, of moving up towards unity, towards towards communion with God, and then moving away from communion and communion with God into multiplicity and fragmentation and breakdown and chaos, all of that. But it's not just the pattern of a story in scripture, it's just the pattern of everything. And so, let's say your organization, you have an organization with a goal, with a purpose, and that purpose is above you. It's invisible. It's not, you can't completely contain it into the things you do, right? All the things you do point towards that invisible point. And if you forget that point, that reason why you do things, then obviously now all of your little idiosyncrasies among the employees are going to start to manifest themselves. You're going to start to fight. Everybody's going to want to be the leader. Everybody's going to want to pull it in every direction, and you rip the organization apart. And the only way to kind of come back together is to remember the garden, or to remember God, or to remember the purpose. And so, of course, the purpose is lower than God, but it's the idea that this pattern kind of fractally manifests itself in all the different aspects of reality. And then you end in the very, very end with the image of the New Jerusalem, where you have the mountain with the tree and the source of life. And then around it now is all that the fall kind of manifested, the city of Cain, all the technology gets glorified and transformed into this kind of total space of everything participating in the glory of God, let's say. And so that's just the basic idea. But the idea is that once you start to kind of see that there's this basic structure in scripture, not only are you able to see it repeated everywhere, a very simple example that you can find in scripture, let's say when Christ walks on water, he sends his disciple on a boat, he goes up a mountain to pray. And while he's up on the mountain, then the disciples are in the boat. Imagine the ark on the flood. They're forgetting Christ, and so they get worried because things are getting choppy out there. There's starting to be waves, and Christ comes down, and when he enters into the boat, they worship him, and then the storm stops and everything becomes calm. So you can see that as, once again, from Genesis to the flood, it's the same structure. It's just totally condensed in that little story of Christ going down the mountain and going out onto the waters into the boat. And so, like I said, and then you can watch a movie and see that it's always the same patterns. You watch a movie, it's usually some aspect of the story of Jesus which is being represented, sometimes deformed, sometimes inverted, but nonetheless, it's kind of pointing towards these images, especially now in a post-Christian world, all these Marvel movies and all these big budget movies. It's always a messianic figure with a death and a resurrection. It's nonstop, just this. We are attracted to the story without even knowing it. We're attracted to the story that Scripture gives us. It's only that, let's say in the past few hundred years, people have been hacking at it, trying to destroy it for us so that we don't even see it anymore, right? Instead of talking about the stories in Scripture, all they talk about is, this source and this source and this source, and conflict between the Yahwist and the Elohist and all this nonsense, so that we don't even see the stories anymore. And so if we can just focus on the actual stories that are there and the actual patterns that, no matter what, who cares about all that other stuff? It's useless to the person trying to live a spiritual life. Then all of a sudden we can kind of enter into these stories again and start to see the world through them, instead of just seeing them as these facts that we accumulate, So that's basically the work that I'm doing on the symbolic world, is trying to help people re-see the world with all its fullness, let's say, all the magic, all the spirit that God has put into it. And the surprise that I've had is, I would say at least half of my public are atheists. And they're just people looking for meaning, people who are tired of the nihilism, people who are sick of being told that the world is meaningless, and they're not just sick of it, they are existentially in danger, and they feel they need to connect to something more. And so they find that the beauty that we see in Scripture, and not just in Scripture, but in the Christian liturgies and in the music and the songs, in the icons, and all of this kind of grand language is a language which actually kind of holds the world together. So gives you a little idea of what I'm doing, let's say.